Hi, this is Shawn Kennedy. I'm the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Nursing, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Bernadette Capili. Dr. Capili is director of the Heilbronn Family Center for Research Nursing at Rockefeller University in New York City. And she's the author, and I should say the series coordinator for a brand new series of columns that we're starting in our October issue called Nursing Research Step by Step. And similar to some of our other step-by-step series, such as evidence-based practice step-by-step and writing for publications step-by-step, and we also had systematic review step-by-step, this one will do a column every other month focusing on one aspect of a step-by-step approach to doing nursing research. So this first column talks about just the essential components of clinical research. And this one will talk about how to start the process, which involves identifying the topic and the development of a well-defined research question. So before, though, we get into talking about the topic per se, the column per se, rather, Candy, which is how I know you, why don't you talk a little bit about what you do in your position at Rockefeller?
Oh, thank you, Shawn. Thank you for having me. Yes, so I direct the Heilbronn Center, and a big part of my role at Rockefeller is really to mentor and to help the nurses at Rockefeller develop their scholarship, understand the research process, teach them about different research methodology. I also work as part of our CTSA grant in workforce development, and again, that all involves a lot of mentorship and teaching about clinical research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, you mentioned the grant, which I should have mentioned that this manuscript and the column is supported in part by a grant from the National Institute of Health's National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences Clinical and Translational Science Awards Program. That's quite a mouthful. So, tell us a little bit about what kind of research the nurses at Rockefeller are involved in. Is it participating in clinical trials? Is it their own studies? What actually are they doing?
You know, a big chunk of our nurses are clinical research nurses, so they are bachelor's or master's prepared, and for that, a lot of them are assisting in actually conducting the actual components of the study, whether it's collecting blood, whether it's processing samples, doing consent, and then we also have another cadre of nurses who are involved with compiling the components for IRB submission
Mm-hmm.
and budgets, and also looking at protocol development. We do have some who are also PhD prepared, who have also undertaken some of their own protocols, working with their different lab principal investigators.
Mm-hmm.
Another project. Also, even though we do have a lot who are master's prepared, and so part of my role is to engage them and to help them, start to do some sort of protocol. And I am serving as a mentor. For example, one team is looking at, and they're all nurse practitioners, looking at the COVID project. So they're looking at a mixed model kind of study with quantitative and qualitative methods, and looking at what's happening with patients with addiction and what they're doing during the pause, as we call it in New York City.
The pause. It was the surge,
Yeah.
and now it's the pause.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen, has Rockefeller, because you're really a research institution, tell us a little bit about what happened during COVID. Were you taking care of patients actively who had COVID?
No, we do have a hospital, but we're unique in that all of our patients are all research participants.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't actually take care of people with heart attacks or
Mm-hmm.
Diabetes. Everyone that comes in must be under a research protocol. So all the studies were actually stopped during now we are actually starting to open up again, but they actually were stopped unless it was COVID related.
Mm-hmm.
But the studies who were patients or participants that were receiving some sort of treatment, whether it's cancer or psoriasis, they were allowed to continue because we felt it was the risks stopping different pharmaceutical type trials.
Mm-hmm.
Was not good for the participants.
Mm-hmm.
So for the most part, it was really you had to get approval in order to keep your projects going. Just, we wanted the campus to be very safe.
Right, right. So in regards to this series, which I was very excited when you agreed to do the series, because I think nursing research is something that everybody now gets a taste of it in school, and certainly massive spirit people, many of them are doing some type of a research, if not a capstone or a quality improvement piece, project rather. And then, of course, we have a lot of doctoral people, but yet, we're talking about doing it in the real world, and clinical research, and nurses, every nurse now has some preparation and is probably going to be doing some type of research at some point in her career, in terms of magnet accreditation, support this, etc. So I was very excited to get this because I think it's certainly needed, and I think the step-by-step approach has seemed to be very popular in the sense of taking off like little bites of the whole research process. So I was happy that you were doing it, and then getting this first column or the first couple of columns, and they are so reader friendly. They're certainly very scholarly, but just such clear and straightforward explanations of the various components. So this first one is really looking at the picking a topic of interest and developing a well-defined question. And one of the things you talked about was the finer mnemonic, in terms of how to decide whether this was a good topic. And I hadn't really come across that. Is that something you use at Rockefeller?
It's something that I used actually when I was a postdoc at Columbia. So it's definitely, and also we used it in some other class I think I had as a doctoral student.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I became familiar with it. And it's actually really great because, so the finer, the F stands for feasibility, and I'll go over a little bit about each component. And I is interesting, and is novel, and E is ethical, and R is relevant. So if you think about feasible, I think what's really important, especially I think most of us as nurses are in the clinical arena, meaning that we will, either whatever, if it's a data set, the data set's involved with humans, or if you're doing clinical trials, or if you're doing qualitative interviews, it all has to do with humans. But I think in someone that does also write grants, any idea you have has to be feasible. Mm-hmm. We can have the best idea, but if you know that you're not going to have the staff or the support to do the study, or maybe not even the budget's really huge, or maybe the time frame, then it's just, it probably won't come up to fruition. So I think that's the big thing with feasibility, is you want to make sure that whatever topic area you're going to address is going to be feasible. Can you measure that? For example, in the article where we talk about blood pressure, that you can measure that. Or sometimes I think with nursing, we may pick something that's a little bit harder to quantify. So if it's like quality of life, right? But there are instruments. But so if it's something that can't be quantifiable, in whether if it's using an instrument like a sphygmometer or a glucometer for blood sugar, then perhaps look for an instrument that can actually measure, such as quality of life or happiness, or I think another big one is like compassion. So, or that you have to develop, and that will be that's another whole other series. And then there's something I is for interesting. So it is something that you want it to be. You yourself should have a passion for it, I think. Otherwise, then, because research, and especially even when you're writing a grant, it doesn't mean you'll get it the first time around. You may have to be submitting that grant, whether it's to a foundation or National Institutes of Health. You may have to submit it all the time. So you just have to have that sense of passion and find it interesting. Look at things that you're looking at the literature. Make sure that there's a gap, perhaps.
Right.
That's one way to really look at one way to address an area that you want to study.
The other thing I was thinking of is interesting. It has to be interesting to more than just yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because again, if it's not interesting to others, because I always think of research that it has to be publishable, right? Because again, when you write something, you can't be so obscure that no one's going to really care about it. Write something that I think, especially if there's a gap. Like, for example, I'm thinking of like rheumatoid arthritis. People so there's psychosocial factors, I think, that people have linked RA with. Maybe you could look at that, or looking at the pain profiles. That's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up, Sean. So novel, the end piece, is I guess it's something to advance the field. I mean, I think in our society, unfortunately, sometimes people think, oh, but what are you doing replicating a study? But the reality is we probably should be replicating more studies because obviously, we can't just put our hats on just one study because
Correct,
one study does not answer it all because most studies will have some sort of flaw because there is really no perfect study. What you want to design it is design it so that it's the best it can be and it can be as rigorous and tight when you're designing this. Otherwise, if your design is flawed, then ultimately the results are, will probably also be flawed. So I think of like novel, I think one of the things I put in the paper is, for example, for hypertension, there's other ways besides just recording a blood pressure. Another way is looking at the patient's diet, and maybe you're going to take a blood pressure, maybe you also take a dietary sodium, you take a urine level for it, right? This way it can also be a tighter measure of your blood pressure reading. And in terms of the E for ethical, that's, your IRB. You want to make sure that your design is going to be ethical, that your patients, your participants is going to be safe, whether it's animal or human. I think that's a really important component. Also make sure that the way you even write the IRB isn't coercive, like you're not giving them too much money. You're also considering what other options are there for patients besides joining your study. I think there's also a great link in the article that if people chose to do, there is a tutorial offered by the NIH. It's free. There's, I think, 40 lectures. Each lecture ranges from 15 to 90 minutes, and you can get a certificate once you complete it.
Oh, that's fabulous.
And then there's the R. It's called, again, the relevant. And again, it's about making sure it's going to add to the science of the literature. So I think that's kind of like the finer, good. I think great take points to consider in picking a topic.
Yeah, and I think it was a great way to start off the series, and then you of course go into the famous PICO and PO questions, which I think many people may not, or at least new nurses new to research, probably more familiar with PICO than they are with the PO questions for population exposure and outcome. So it's just, I think it's a great introduction into the whole series, and we'll get people thinking. So, and that's this one in October, and I think the next one after this will be probably in January. We had we had set up every other month, but what with COVID content coming in and having to readjust some content, so we had to skip 2 months instead of one. But then once we get into January, it should be steadily every other month, so people can follow along and look for it. So I'm very excited about the series. So thank you for doing it. And
thank you.
And I know you enlisted some colleagues as well who'll be working on the series with you, authoring some of the different columns.
So they're Alexa Curtis and Courtney Keeler, and they're both faculty at UCSF. They also work with the DNP students over there.
Oh, great. Well, Candy, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about the series, and we'll talk just before the next column then.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean. Have a great day.
You too.